Welcome to Lawyer and Layman Explain It. This is a show where we discuss topics related to law and social justice from the perspective of a layperson who has much more experience at the local gym's basketball court than any court of law, and
someone who has met not one but two different Supreme Court justices. One when I was in college, and actually before they were a member of the court, and the other in law school. Before we dive into our episode, quick disclaimer. This podcast is for educational purposes only and is not intended to provide any legal advice. If you need legal advice, you might want to pause this podcast and find a lawyer.
But then come back. Please come back.
Any inaccuracies are unintentional, and facts could change at any time. Do your own research.
Now, I do want to stipulate, I don't have no experience in a court of law. I have had traffic tickets. Young Martin was a bit of a speedster. And then I also really wanted to stipulate that experience at like the local 24-hour fitness. Yes, I have experience on the court, but I'm definitely not a basketball player. This was the first thing that came to mind knowing we're going to be talking about the Supreme Court today.
Martin, don't let Martin fool you. He is definitely a baller. So I just let the record reflect.
Objection? I don't know. I'm trying to hearsay? I don't know.
I guess hearsay because I've never actually seen you play basketball live. Did you know that? Or were you aware of that?
Yeah, I think thinking back, I don't think you have.
Wild.
Like we've played around on a basketball court outside with your dad actually. But yeah, again, more qualified to talk about a random court than a Supreme Court for sure.
All right. So in our last few episodes, we've been talking about, as Martin pointed out, to the United States Supreme Court. We started with the Supreme Court 101 episodes, giving some basic facts about the court.
Wait, time out. Before we get into the intro.
Yes.
I'm going to do some cutting here. I'm curious. You definitely, not only by ways of being a lawyer, having your JD and a member of two bars now.
Yes.
Not only because of that are you much more qualified to talk about the Supreme Court, but you've met two Supreme Court justices. I believe you told me one, and it was probably like a commencement or something, or no. Okay, tell me more.
It is true that one of the justices, Justice Sonia Sotomayor, was a commencement speaker, but I actually met her when I was a student worker for my university's law school before I attended said law school. And she attended an event at Battery Park. And I shook her hand, and I, after the fact, was thinking like, why did I ever wash my hand? Like, Justice Sotomayor shook this hand. But, I mean, it was a while afterwards, so only plausible I would have washed my hand. And then I have told you about the second, Justice Elena Kagan. She participated in a law school event. We had a moot court event, and she was kind enough to participate, which I still, to this day, I'm starstruck and amazed that she agreed to spend her time at our law school. So, yes, two powerhouses. It's great to meet the both of them.
That's super cool. I have heard that the Supreme Court or like clerks or people affiliated with the Supreme Court do like to do stuff like that in like schools in DC, which
yes,
of course adds to the list of reasons schools in DC are probably good if you do want to do Supreme Courting or probably politicking.
True. Up and down that whole East Coast, actually, I would say you have some odds of getting a Supreme Court justice to your school. Not to say that other schools across the country cannot also get Supreme Court justice to visit, but it does seem like you kind of see the feeder track. We'll talk about that on another episode 2, but there's certain schools and then lower court judges that are known as feeders to the Supreme Court. So there's these pre-existing relationships that mean you tend to see Supreme Court justices at certain locations because they have connections or they've had clerks or other folks that they know that have attended that university. But more topics for us to talk about in future episodes.
For sure, a myriad of reasons. And then I do want to comment, super cool, it was Sotomayor too. She's a New York kid, right? Like,
I
So
that's right.
It makes sense that she'd go to like
talk about her more.
A battery park. Yeah, we definitely have to have episodes devoted to her, and I'm sure we will many other justices. But yeah, that's super cool. Like what a cool memory to have for you to be able to meet these two.
Definitely New York's kid, Bronx kid at that. That is, I definitely remember her telling a story or two at commencement about her childhood.
Growing up in the Bronx.
Yes.
That might have to get cut. I had to try. Luckily, I can also edit. So
we love to have our listeners have a chance to hear Martin's impressions and accents. So it gives the listeners exposure. My votes, keep it in.
Trying to think of an accented response, but I got nothing.
All right. So in our last few episodes, we've been talking about the United States Supreme Court. We started with the Supreme Court 101 episodes, giving some basic facts about the court. And then we talked about the history and the origin of the court and talked about how a few of the past courts, actually all of the past courts, were defined by their Chief Justice.
And if you haven't heard them, go back and listen to those episodes so you can have a little bit more context. We just scratched the surface, but it does help set the scene a little bit.
Thanks, Martin. Today we're going to start the last segment of our SCOTUS deep dive. We'll be introducing you to the modern Supreme Court. Martin, how are you feeling as we get into this discussion?
Just like the past episodes on the Supreme Court that we've had, there is so much to be said. And just like every single one of our episodes, I have done zero preparation, but this is one of those that I kind of feel like I wish I would have prepared more, because we're definitely going to have to do some more follow-up episodes, and there's just a lot to be said.
Something tells me that you will have commentary during this episode. So I've said this before, but I want listeners to know I'm not an expert in this area. So as we often say, do your own research. And if there's any Supreme Court experts out there, as always, you are welcome to let us know if we missed anything or got anything wrong. All right, Martin, because I know you're a Jeopardy head, we're going to kick things off with some trivia. Not Jeopardy style, because I don't want to risk my gavel again, but we're going to start things out with some trivia. Can you name all of the sitting members of the current Supreme Court?
Ooh, that's tough. Okay. I'm going to start with all the easy ones. There's Justice Jackson, Justice Sotomayor. There is Thomas, Roberts, the beer frat boy Brett Kavanaugh. That's 5. There's Miss Handmaiden herself, Amy Barrett. Did I say Alito? Okay, I'm throwing Alito on there. Is Kagan still there? Kagan's there. There's 8. Who am I missing? Oh gosh. He's the white conservative. That really narrows it down on the Supreme Court.
Who is the Chief Justice?
No, I said Roberts.
Oh, yeah, you did. That's everyone, then.
No.
Somehow I blanked on you saying Roberts, but that was everyone. I was keeping track.
No. Who did I
That was
have?
everyone.
Justice Jackson?
Ooh, that was not everyone.
It was not. No, yes, there's one more, and he's one of those. He's one of the ones. Shoot. It's always hard to get.
You did a great job.
Last ones.
You were doing fantastically.
I want to say if we would hold up, I could maybe try to get it eventually, but in the interest of time and the fact that we have the free version of Zoom for this recording.
Yes, listeners, we're balling on a budget.
Let's go ahead and I'll take 8 out of 9.
Which would be a perfectly acceptable grade on an exam in school. So Martin did a fantastic job. And I would like listeners to know that if you are a layperson and you can name 8 out of the 9 justices, number one, I'm sorry for you because you probably know about them because of terrible things happening in the news. But also, I'm proud of you because that's a lot of names to remember. So Martin has covered the bases, but I will say all the names that are listed on supremecourt.gov so that you all have them. And we're going to start with the Chief Justice and proceed alphabetically by name. Martin kicked us off with Chief Justice John G. Roberts Jr., respect on his name. Then we have proceeding alphabetically by last name. And I'm going to ask Martin to reserve his opinions for the episodes where we deep dive on each of these justices. We have Associate Justice Samuel A. Alito Jr., Associate Justice Amy Coney Barrett, Associate Justice Neil M. Gorsuch, Associate Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, Associate Justice Elena Kagan, Associate Justice Brent M. Kavanaugh, Associate Justice Sonia Sotomayor, and Associate Justice Clarence Thomas. Now, Martin, I have an image of this current court in the document that we're working from today. Here's a visual. And I would like for you to describe the members of the court for people who, maybe just haven't seen these folks or are new to the U.S. or for whatever reason just are not aware of who these individuals are. And again, I will ask you to reserve your opinions on character and personality. Just describe for our listeners what this court looks like.
Yeah, if I were to describe the picture, much like actually the last picture of the Supreme Court, there's like a red velvety curtain backdrop behind them. But honestly, the first thing, even including my opinions, the first thing that I think of when I see this is probably the most representative in terms of like visually. The Supreme Court probably has ever been. Like, I can't imagine it's looked more diverse in terms of who is making up the court. In fact, that there's black and brown skin. There are women. That's a huge piece.
When you say representative for our audience, you mean representative of the demographics of the United States,
of the people, right?
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Like if I didn't know anything about these people, I'd be like, wow, this is a really diverse court. There's relatively younger and older members of the court. There's men, there's women. There are darker skinned and men and women. And there's like diversity. It's just, I can't imagine a time where demographically the court has better reflected the population of the U.S. than what is pictured here.
It's all very interesting for sure. And thank you for that. I think that'll be of value to our listeners. Now I'm going to keep pop quizzing you because that's fun. And I just wanted to get your answers on these things. Do you know who's been on the current court the longest?
Is it Thomas or is it Alito?
Ding, ding, ding with the first answer.
Yeah.
That would be Justice Thomas, who's been on the court since October 1991.
Oh, Thomas.
And do you know who joined the most recently? I know
yes, you know. Of course. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson.
Yes, who joined the court in June of 2022.
The first black woman to serve on the Supreme Court of the U.S.
And I'm going to try my best in this episode to hold off on thoughts because those are going to come. But I got to just say, Justice Jackson, I'm just so happy for you, girl. Okay, moving along. So there's a lot of information already out there about the Supreme Court as a body and about the individual justices. Martin, we decided to do these episodes despite the fairly saturated market of books and podcasts and other forms of media and learning about the Supreme Court. And I'm curious, what value do you think we have to add to the conversation?
Well, to the point of the saturated market, I think it's because there's so much to be said about the current Supreme Court. I'm not sure, and so many topics within law ultimately would either rely on the law itself or precedent that potentially makes its way to the Supreme Court. So I think laying some of that framework is important into how it operates in the history and yes, how cases are decided. I'm not sure that I'm looking to add value. I think this is going to be a venting session for me. So I don't know if there's that, like if there's value in laughing and critiquing the court. That's my value for sure.
And I think, at least from my awareness, and I could be wrong because I don't know all the podcasts or news interviews that have ever broached the topic of the Supreme Court, But I do think it's rare to have a setting like this where you have somebody who has studied law and who is a practicing lawyer having a conversation with a layperson who is aware of current events, of news, who has consumed information about these justices, but also approaches the topic as a person who has not studied law. I think that could allow our conversation to be approachable and interesting, I hope, for our listeners. So we talked about how we might approach this discussion because we could and we do talk for hours about the Supreme Court. So for our listeners, here's what we're going to do. And for Martin's benefit too, we're going to spend a couple episodes talking about how this court has evolved and stayed in line in some respect with the Rehnquist Court, which we discussed in the last episode. And then we're going to spend a bunch of episodes covering each justice. Martin, is that cool?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to break it down. And even in these expansive episodes, like we really could probably spend forever talking about so many things.
Yes, completely agree. So we'll jump right in. The modern court era starts in 2005. That's when Roberts was nominated and confirmed as Chief Justice. Martin, do you recall who was president in 2005?
George W. Bush.
Ding, ding, ding. And as we talked about in an earlier episode, the president nominates the Chief Justice. So yes, President Bush nominated Roberts. And for our listeners that maybe weren't in the United States at that time, or maybe even weren't born yet, 2000s babies. Martin, for their benefit, can you tell us what was going on in the United States in 2005? To the best of your recollection. I mean, you were a teenage and maybe doing teenage things.
I think, let's see, 2005, I had to remind myself. We were like in the middle of high school. Yeah, there was a war in Afghanistan. The Iraq War had maybe not started yet. I can't remember.
Well, you keep commenting. I will be Googling.
Let's see, what else is going on? 50 Cent was huge. Chappelle's show. Yeah, it was right before the economic crash because that was in 2008, right?
Correct. Great Recession, yep.
So, yeah, I think it was still like that momentum from like 90s American exceptionalism was continuing, you know. We had, yeah.
I appreciate that you brought up 50 Cent, but did not mention the tall tees and long jerseys and sweatbands of the era. And as for the Iraq War, internet's telling me 2003. So yes, that would have still been going on.
LeBron was probably still on his rookie contract at that time, I'm thinking. I think it was 2001. I think it was 2001 NBA draft, something like that. Yeah.
I have zero comments to our listeners because I don't know. I will do my own research on that topic. So, Martin, you read...
Sorry, quick Google search. So, it was 2003. So, LeBron definitely still on his rookie contract.
Okay.
Had a couple years in the NBA at this point.
Okay. Fascinating. And so, listeners know Martin and I are both experiencing great pain right now because our chief executive officer / podcast pup is taking a nap, supposed to be at least, and she's crying outside of the room, making it very much pulling at the heartstrings as we record. Martin, you read Supreme Inequality, Adam Cohen's book about the evolution of the Supreme Court, which we did mention in our last episode. From what you read, what would you say, if you can remember, and if this came up, what would you say are some common characteristics between the Rehnquist Court and the Roberts Court?
I mean, overall, the court stayed pretty conservative, and I think it continued the trend of picking and deciding cases on the side of corporate interests.
Okay. I think that is a very fair summary, although there were some ebbs and flows, and we'll talk about those. A source I used to prepare for today is the transcript from a 2005 NPR interview about Rehnquist's passing and legacy and Roberts' appointment, which was released the day that Justice Roberts was nominated to be Chief Justice. The interviewees in this interview are a black Harvard law professor named Charles Ogletree and the then president of the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund, or LDF. and that person is Ted Shaw. We won't have time to get into the entire interview, but I highly encourage listeners to listen because the link that we provide will have audio, or read the transcript. And of course, we will provide a link in our references doc, which is in our show notes. Martin, I want to call attention to some interesting excerpts from that interview. So can you read this excerpted language detailing the importance of the Chief Justice, just to remind us of kind of some of the key aspects of this role compared to the Associate Justice role?
Obviously, all of the Supreme Court justices are incredibly powerful in shaping legal policy. But what does the Chief Justice do? One of the professors responds, "I think some people overstate and others understate the role of the Chief Justice. One of the most important roles, of course, if he or she is in the majority, and if an opinion, they choose who will write the actual opinion. That's a very important, substantive piece of power."
So given what we've discussed on prior episodes of the podcast, what are your reactions just to this piece of information?
Yeah, I'm trying to whittle down what it means. The first sentence is kind of wishy-washy in that some people overstate and others understate the role of the Chief Justice. And I think, it's fitting. It depends on, I always say this, the context. Who is the Chief Justice? How do their politics align with the rest of the court? The time, the political climate. But yeah, narrowing in on, kind of trimming away that one of the real point there, I think, is the important role is choosing who will write an actual opinion. And that's interesting. I think maybe a peek behind the curtain. It sounds like it's just a unilateral decision. The Chief Justice says, you get to write. And I think it is a very important substantive piece of power because, as the justices serve, you get to learn who they are, how they are, and the written part of decisions. That's a very concrete record, specifically what was decided and how.
Yes, and when you think about whose name leads or is at the top of a majority opinion, because we had our episode where we walked through the anatomy of a Supreme Court opinion, and when you can associate a name to an opinion, let's take Dobbs, for example, the one that overruled Roe versus Wade. There are names that are attached to these, and they're sort of meaningful milestones in history. It's almost hard to separate the opinion from the person, even though we know that there's multiple people on a court that constitute the body of folks that wrote an opinion. So it is interesting. I think you're right. The importance of the person who ends up writing the actual opinions.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. It's kind of that self-fulfilling prophecy, the justices, while we expect the courts to interpret and resolve things logically and in a very almost like mathematical way, it is also a very political body and always has been. And the fact that somebody's name gets attached to, as you said, very, a landmark decision or something that it becomes part of their legacy, it kind of feeds into their other decisions. And okay, what are, maybe their perspectives hold more weight, or a decision that is attached to their name changes how we view how certain justices practiced or interpreted, or what their views were, I guess.
Yeah, right. The interview does a great job describing Rehnquist's philosophy in comparison to Chief Justice Roberts. I've got something else for you to read. Martin, can you read this text from one of the professors in the interview?
The LDF, which is the Legal Defense Fund, president says, he, Rehnquist, was a very difficult vote for us to get, but he certainly had a tremendous impact on the court, on the jurisprudence. He started as an outlier when he was appointed to the court. By the end of his life, he was right there in control of a very conservative court that may get to be even more conservative.
So, Martin, again, this interview is from 2005. So we reading this right now in 2024, we have the benefit of hindsight. And we know that the court indeed became more conservative. That said, please keep reading.
His decisions is where it made a difference. He was the Lone Ranger. He was out there in dissent. He wrote, He was in the majority in Bush versus Gore that stopped the vote in Florida in 2000 against affirmative action in the Michigan case, one of the two dissenters in Roe versus Wade. He has carefully and effectively, over the last 33 years, cut back on exclusionary rule, giving police more power and suspects less power. And when it comes to racial profiling, people have to be very concerned that the court has moved in a very, very conservative area that provides less protection for people than before. So that's part of the legacy.
And Martin, that kind of came up in our last episode, right, when we were talking about the Rehnquist Court and when you were reflecting on what you're reading in Supreme Inequality. That did come up in our last discussion, right, when we talked about the Rehnquist Court, the nature of it becoming more conservative and starting to see political, not even starting to see, but the increasing role of politicalization. That doesn't feel like it was the right word. The increasing role of politics on Supreme Court justices and seeing political interest capture justices. That piece that you read about the court moving in a very conservative area, that tracks with what you were reading in Supreme Inequality. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I think, as I mentioned, it's impossible to separate politics from the court because they are political appointees, and they're a major piece of our government, which is political in nature. But I think, the clear politicization and the polarization, I think, and the fact that the ideal of the court is justice for all, right? Wasn't that as part of a few pieces of text, right?
It's a nice written platitude. It actually being executed, totally different story.
Right. And to be fair, you can never get rid of the human element, but the fact that we're seeing that justices eventually have records, we understand who they are and can anticipate how they're going to interpret things based on politics, popular opinion. It's not necessarily how it should be.
It's definitely not how it should be. It's supposed to be the counter-majoritarian body. So
right, justice is supposed to be blind and weigh the scales of justice evenly. But
yeah. So what you read gives us some really helpful context to ground us about Rehnquist. Can you continue with the next bit of text that gives us a little more detail on Chief Justice Roberts?
Professor Ogletree says, given John Roberts' record as a judge and as a lawyer, it clearly will make this court swing even further to the right than it might have been with Chief Justice Rehnquist. It continues, we shouldn't be fooled in thinking that Roberts is going to be anything different than a conservative based on his views about federalism, his views about affirmative action, his views about Roe versus Wade. And our hope is that he will follow law as it has been established and not see this as an opportunity to swing more decisively to the right.
Martin, what are your thoughts about what you just read?
About how it became an opportunity to swing more decisively to the right. There's a lot to be said there. And I think we've seen many examples of some of these justices that we're probably going to talk about today say one thing in their confirmation hearings, and you have these complete opposite decisions, literally, specifically Roe versus Wade, and talking about Dobbs. There's recordings. There's C-SPAN recordings of these people saying things, and yet, as maybe predicted here by Professor Ogletree, it was that opportunity to swing decisively to the right.
The predictions can be a bit chilling, I think, and I really do encourage listeners to read this transcript or listen to the interview because it's really insightful and it provides some interesting grounding as we think about today's court. The court's had a decent amount of change since 2005. To be precise, aside from Chief Justice Rehnquist, there have been 7 judges that have left the court, either from retirement or passing away. So, Martin, that means in our lifetime, and I want to put a fine point on it, not just our lifetime, but really even since the beginning of the period of our life where we started to have conscious thoughts about politics and we're almost old enough to vote, even from that point, there's been tremendous change in the court's composition. Were you aware of that much change happening in a fairly short period?
No, definitely not. When you said that there have been 7 judges to leave the court, like I was really surprised. It sounds like a lot. Like, of course, we'd have to look over the history of the court, but that sounds like a lot because these are lifetime appointments. So people don't leave, unless there's a serious reason to. But that definitely seems like a lot. Yeah, and there's definitely been a trend of how the court's been moving in, as you said, really in our kind of conscious lifetime, in our actual lifetime, and really for probably a couple of decades more than that.
Right, exactly. So we'll dive a little deeper into how that turnover since 2005 has impacted the court and therefore impacted us as citizens of the United States. It's probably easiest to think of the evolution of the Roberts Court in terms of presidencies. So that's what we're going to do here, Martin. We're going to kind of trace the evolution as we think about who was the executive. We'll start with the remainder of the Bush years, so 2005 to 2008. Not a ton of change in terms of how the court approached its decision making, but there was some change. Justice O'Connor, who served on the Rehnquist Court and who was the first woman on the court, retired and was replaced by another conservative, Justice Alito, a white guy because we didn't have enough of those on the court. I want to also encourage listeners to check out a New York Times article about the most interesting cases from the 2007-2008 term because they provide a really interesting snapshot of this period. The article's really worth a read. Some highlights for you, Martin. There was a case with a 5-4 split, and we talked about what that means. 5 justices on the majority side and then 4 in the dissent. There was a 5-4 split in a case ruling that detainees at Guantanamo Bay could petition their detention in federal court. There was also a 5-3 split in a case making it harder to bring class action claims for securities fraud against investment banks. And I'm really hoping that Martin heard me say 5-3 and realized that number does not add up to 9. Any reactions to those 2 highlight cases? Anything you found interesting?
So those 2 cases specifically, I think the Guantanamo Bay, that was definitely, that was one of the first things that I recall when we talked about this era and W. Bush being president, the wars in the Middle East and the resulting war crimes committed because of that. And then, the 5-3 split is interesting, and I'm curious why one judge wasn't available to decide for whatever reason. But one question is, O'Connor was conservative, but Alito was more conservative, wasn't he? Because to my knowledge, it seems like most of the judges over the last 50 years have really just been moving the court further and further to the right, which is saying something.
I do think that is an accurate reflection of how we've seen decisions come to bear. And I also want to point out that the way conservatism looks now is just different. It's deeply entrenched in a way that just looks and feels different, I think, to a lot of folks. We'll talk more about that, and in particular, we'll talk more about the fact that there were some justices on the court that were appointed by conservative presidents who made different actions than justices on today's court that were appointed by conservative presidents. So it's really interesting to see what conservative ideology informing a justice's background looks like now versus even during the Rehnquist era. But yes, Justice O'Connor was appointed by a conservative president. Oh, yes, please.
I was going to say that's a great clarification because the Overton window of politics in America has moved to the right. So even though, not only has the court gotten more conservative, but even what being conservative means has changed. So it just when I was saying it, moving further to the right and that's saying something, I think it was already right, and it just continues to, the way that the law is interpreted keeps, and I mean, I'm sure we'll discuss the interesting ways in which it is interpreted.
Totally.
Yeah.
Which, by nature also has to mean that liberalism looks different. So things that were a moderate position now could maybe be viewed as liberal or even progressive in a way that one could argue doesn't make sense. There used to be a broader swath of common ground than I think there is in a lot of cases. But going back to your 5-3, did one of the justices say, it's my hunting day, like on the first Supreme Court, and decide not to show up? That is not what happened. So one of the justices, Justice Breyer, recused himself from the securities fraud case. And there are speculations, although the internet is not really, there's not great definitive sources. A lot of them seem to point to speculation. That it was because he held stock in one of the corporate parties. And again, this was a securities fraud case, so it involved a class action claim against financial institutions. And for our audience, recusal is when a judge decides not to participate in making a decision because of a possible conflict. So yes, Martin, there was a time where judges recused due to conflicts. Whoa! A bygone era, it seems.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously you wouldn't want any sort of even like auspice or idea of impropriety, especially on the Supreme Court. No justice would ever dare risk that.
Impropriety? What's that? Ah, yes, impropriety. So, Martin, as you think about the 2005 to 2008 time period, that first segment of the Roberts Court, anything else interesting about this period from your reading of Supreme Inequality?
I'm sure there was. However, can I remember? That's a definite no. Was Citizens United during that time? Probably was, right?
It was not, because I have stuff to say about that.
Oh, interesting. Here we go. I can't recall. I'm sure there was. We should do like a book review, and I could give its thorough props, because it definitely dropped a lot of knowledge and wove a storytelling in a way that makes sense. And it was referential back to cases and built on them. It was an amazing read. I could not do it justice, especially off the top of my head right now.
I agree with that. And I want listeners to know that Martin and I have kicked around the idea where it's like a flip on lawyer and layman. It's reader and non-reader, perhaps. And Martin, as the voracious reader, educates all of us about a book. And I ask questions and chime in with some thoughts. So stay tuned. We may be bringing you just that. So we will move on to the next era, or I suppose I will say portion of the Roberts era, because we are switching to a different president. So we'll talk about 2008 to 2016 with the two back-to-back Obama presidencies. In this time, a Ford appointee and an H.W. Bush appointee retire. And President Obama makes two additions to the court, both women, and we'll spend more time talking about both of them, each of them. This brings the court to the highest number of liberals, or I should say, justices that were appointed by liberal presidents, Democrat presidents, highest number of liberals that the court has had in the Roberts era, and that number is 4. Plus, though, in addition to that 4, a conservative justice that was considered liberal, plus, a justice who swings. And we'll talk about what that means shortly. Things are by no means perfect in this Obama time frame. And I want to make that very clear. Martin told you all, or previewed for you all, a little case called Citizens United. The full case name is Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, or FEC. And that case is responsible for corporations being able to spend as much money as they want on elections. That case was decided in 2010. Martin, I know you know something about Citizens United, so tell us how you really feel about it. I know you have feelings.
I don't know if I could tell everyone how I really feel about it. I mean, it's ridiculous on its premise. It equates money as free speech and gives corporations like was it the first one that gave corporations personhood? But either way, it said that corporations as people have free speech, and that also means money. So, they have an outsized control of money and so outsized influence, but that's, they're just people, these corporations.
Corporations are people too.
So there's that. It's got us where, I guess where we are today. And that can't be that bad, right? Just unlimited money in elections like that.
Seems safe.
Whatever could go wrong. I guess I wanted to point back to there's a Ford appointee who retired. Like,
yes,
Ford seems like so long ago.
It does.
And I think that also, underscores how crazy it is that there were 7 changes on the court since 2005. It was a lot.
Yes. Very, very good point.
And so there were 2 justices appointed by Obama who were Sotomayor and RBG. No, RBG had been on the court for a while. Was she Clinton? 90s. She was Clinton.
Correct. Sotomayor and who else did I meet?
Kagan.
Yes.
Okay. Cool.
So, keep that in mind. Citizens United decided 2010. That was before Justice Kagan joined the court. That case was a 5-4 split. So you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, we didn't have the 4 liberals yet because Kagan had not joined the court. It was not the 4 liberals that you'd expect in that dissent. A justice appointed by a conservative president was also in the dissent. Justice Stevens wrote a scathing dissent about how Citizens United would destroy democracy. This was a unique time in the Roberts Court where justices that sort of crossed over ideological lines in a way we really have not seen since. And it's just very interesting. I mean, Stevens had this rep of being conservative or appointed by a Republican president, but then a sort of operative liberal, which is super fascinating. And I believe he was the Ford appointee, but I'm double checking what the internet tells me. Yes. Justice Stevens, who left the court during the sort of first part of the Roberts era, was appointed by President Ford in 1975. So, yes, Ford was a decent time ago. So we're not talking a ton about this Obama time period, and it's, as always, we don't dive in, not because we don't want to, but because of time, and we want these episodes to be really digestible for you all. That said, though, Martin, what are your thoughts on the fact that 2008 to 2016 was a time where Obama was president, so Democrat was in charge of the executive office. He makes 2 appointments, 2 women to the court, but we also have Citizens United. How do you feel about that period of time?
How do I feel, huh? I think many people point to Citizens United, and rightfully so, as sort of a changing of the tides of how politics in America really has polarized, I guess, and has changed. The injection of money, oh my gosh, the obvious implications, right? There's so much more corruption. Like how can anyone think that that's the right way to decide? So there's that. I think it is interesting that it is the backdrop of our first black president, him having 2 terms. I think the thing that we skip over is how he was not allowed a third appointment, supposedly because of it being an election year and his last year in office, and he's got this last year. It's way too soon to an election. Let the American people decide, which is totally, that's just the way things are. So we got to do it that way, and we'll never deviate from that. Like, that's just, an unspoken rule. It must not be broken.
You are very nicely segueing to the next portion of the Roberts Court, 2016 to 2020. That whole 2016 election thing. Yep. I think you summed it up really well, Martin. A reality TV personality gets elected. Chaos reigns. One of the conservative justices passes away while Obama's still president, though. And as Martin said, there was a ton of drama around his nominee. And there was all this kerfuffle about how close it was to election and inauguration. And that's why his nominee did not get added to the court. So then reality TV dude gets to pick. And then he gets to pick 2 more times. So that means that the court leans with it, rocks with it way far to the right during this period. And I'll also note that questions arise about whether some of these picks had the proper qualifications to be on the court. Flashback to our episodes about Supreme Court 101, which again, we recommend listening to. And, there's not built into the Constitution a requirement for age or even having gone to law school, all these things, right? They kind of naturally evolved. We naturally have had Supreme Court justices that have gone to law school, and for the most part, they've gone to kind of the top echelon Ivy League schools. Top echelon as in that's what their rankings are. I have a whole set of issues with Ivy League that I may share in another episode. But yes, you tend to see Supreme Court justices have a certain common background elements. So it's interesting that in this 2016-2020 timeframe, we start to see so many more questions raised about reality TV dudes, nominees, and whether they were qualified for the court. I do want listeners to remember our standard motto, which is do your own research. There was a ton of media coverage around this. And again, we could spend a whole episode on this, but we will not. So please go check out some resources on this. And Martin, it sounds like you remember all of this chaos, all of this frenzy. Although there was a whole pandemic happening toward the end of it, so I don't blame you if you didn't catch every single detail about these 4 years. But, that was its own part of the Robert Courts era, right? Which stood in stark contrast to the prior 8 years that we talked about. Any thoughts?
Oh, yeah, a lot. I think, unfortunately, I paid a lot of attention to this period of time. And I think a lot of us painfully digested a lot of the details. There's a lot here, and I know we are going to go into further detail into some of these individuals. So I think maybe we'll save some of that for then. But yeah, I mean, even the process, as we discussed, the president nominates somebody. It's Congress's job to approve. It's the Senate's job to vote. And Obama famously picked Merrick Garland as a conservative choice because Mitch McConnell, the decrepit Senate Majority Leader, had stated, well, we know he wouldn't even pick someone moderate like Merrick Garland. And then Obama called his bluff, nominated him, which, I mean, what else can you, maybe he read the writing on the wall that there was not going to be somebody getting passed. Of course, they filibustered. So instead of doing their job of affirming or denying, they just said, nope, we're going to take the ball and go home. And then, yes, to your point on the qualifications, I do think, there's a lot to be said about the education and the backgrounds, but I think there's nuance there, and that you probably would want somebody with experience before the court. And I think there's something to be said about some of these specific individuals and some notorious cases that we had talked about being before the court. Gosh, yes, there's a web of directions and paths that we could go down. And
tangled one.
As we began with, we could spend all day and forever.
Yes.
Talking about all these things. So
right.
Oh yes, specifically this period, chaos and frenzy. Frenzy is a good way to put it. Yeah, pretty chaotic.
Which leads to our latest segment of the Robert Court, 2020 to present. I'm going to start off on a positive note, though. Bright shining light, our lovely one, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, joins the court in 2022. And yes, listeners, I know I said it, that I would hold my judgment and thoughts about individual justices, but it's like like just energy coming from me, radiating from me when I just think about Justice Jackson, and just to see that representation matter so much on the court. But alas, the court is now divided with 6 conservative appointed justices, and 3 justices that were appointed by the liberal president, Democratic president. And everyone is deeply entrenched in their positions. Roberts generally decides with the conservatives, although there's broader consensus sometimes. I mean, we still sometimes see unanimous decisions. Listeners, we will share a Ballotpedia link that charts how often Justice Roberts and other justices decide in the same way. You might find it surprising. At minimum, you might find it at least somewhat interesting and curious, because there's some justices he decides with, in some years, 100% of the time. Some of them might have had beer hats. I will leave you to guess who that might be. And then there's other justices that he decides with far less frequently, in the sort of high 50%, low 60% of the time. And those are justices on sort of the other side of the ideological spectrum. So it's interesting to see that data, because it really represents on a page and a chart that you are really seeing these partisan trends, and people tend to stick along party lines. Again, this is supposed to be the insulated, counter, majoritarian, non-political branch of government, and yet, period. We've talked about some of the cases from this part of the Roberts era. So, for example, we talked about Alexander versus South Carolina in a prior episode. That was the recent gerrymandering case. And as we know, it's become abundantly clear from the 2016 timeframe onward that voting rights and civil rights face an uphill battle. So, now you have seen all the sort of picture of how the Roberts Court has evolved over the years. Any reactions, Martin?
Over how it's evolved over the years is, it's something. I mean, I think it's kind of stayed where it's at, despite, as you said, kind of an uphill battle that it's been facing. I think, this last kind of segment of the Roberts era, we have to share the bright light that is Justice Jackson, who, talk about qualifications, someone who is definitely qualified. Wasn't she on the DC
Court of Appeals?
Court of Appeals, yeah. So yes, also I feel for her having to work with seeing some of the stuff coming out, particularly about this Roberts Court, and like some of the things, not necessarily the court and the decisions, but I mean, frankly, some of the corruption we've seen surrounding the court. I can't imagine having to deal with both. Being part of this minority of liberals on the court, and the importance of this job and what it took to get there, and then seeing, frankly, a buffoon and someone who barely has any court experience sitting next to you. Like, I couldn't imagine how difficult that is. Yeah, I think that you also do speak to the interesting, I think maybe it's because we have more information and we're seeing that it's more the court is more politicized. There's definitely a game though, I think, with Roberts too. People often cite, I believe, that they believe he cares about his legacy. So the way that he votes, and I mean, in fact, as you mentioned, some of the other characters, shall we say, on the court, the way they vote and the way their personalities show through in their kind of voting patterns. Again, maybe because we just have access to a lot more of this information and more readily. It's interesting. Yeah, it paints a picture of who these people are and how they perform this extremely important job.
Well said. Very well said. We're going to touch on a lot of what you pointed out. We have so much more to talk about that we are going to need another episode just to discuss this overall Roberts Court before we move on to the deep dives of each justice. And Martin, I suggest today, though, we call this episode a wrap because we've been through a lot. I mean, just tracing back 2005 to 2024, just some of the things that have happened has been quite a lot to deal with today.
Yes, this episode has felt very heavy. And yet we laugh because sometimes it's all we can do, right? Right.
So true. Well, Martin, as we approach the end of our episode, are there any calls to action that you have in mind for our listeners? Anything that you think lay folks should be thinking about as they are considering these issues?
Before you said anything about a call to action, the first thing I thought was I need some more candy, which is not a good advice to be sharing with people. But no, I mean, a call to action, like, bear with us through this. Thanks for listening and tuning in, and be educated about what's going on.
Thank you, Martin, for plugging to continue to listen to our episodes, and in particular, the next episode where we follow up on this discussion. And of course, as we talked about at the beginning of the episode, there's so many great resources out there. Please continue to be informed and educate yourselves. We have already shared with you the Supreme Inequality book by Adam Cohen. There's a great podcast called Above the Law, Thinking Like a Lawyer. We'll be talking about an episode from that podcast in the next episode of ours. And then there's the Strict Scrutiny podcast, which is just a really fantastic piece of art that goes into Supreme Court issues. We'll be providing links to these resources as well. Martin, can you hit us with an outro?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks everyone for tuning in. As you wait for our next episode, check us out at Lawyer and Layman Pod on Instagram and Threads, and Lawyer and Layman on YouTube, TikToks, and Twitter or X. If you dig the podcast, don't forget to like and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Let us know if there are any topics you'd like us to explore. Don't walk around not knowing.